All right, this is the first chapter or the first lecture of Unit 2, although I guess you guys have already done the lab on this. So because we talked about tissues in lab already, I'm not going to be talking about each individual tissue type specifically. So you're going to want to go back to that tissues lab PowerPoint and look through the PowerPoint and make sure that you know the different types of fibers that are in each type of connective tissue, how many layers are in each type of epithelial tissue, and so on. So we're going to be going through the basic tissue types and then as well as the functions of the tissues. And we'll be focusing a little bit more on functions, and we might review some locations of those tissues too. So what exactly is a tissue? Remember we said the study of tissues is called histology. Tissues are groups of similar cells as well as extracellular material. So it's not just cells, it's also all the other stuff that's outside of those cells. We're going to have a bunch of tissues that work together to perform, a bunch of cells working together to perform a common function, and that's going to form a tissue. What are the four main tissue types? You should know this from lab. They are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue. And they all have different structures and functions. We're going to start talking about epithelial tissue first. And we can also call it an epithelium. So if we have a covering of epithelial tissue, we can call that an epithelium. And this is composed of one or more layers of closely packed cells that contain little to no extracellular matrix. So this part should be reviewed from our lab. Epithelium is found covering body surfaces and lining body cavities. So either lining, the serous membranes that we talked about in chapter 1 are going to be lined with epithelium. It also, like our skin, is going to be covered in epithelial tissue. Another important thing that epithelial tissue does is it forms the majority of our glands, both the endocrine and the exocrine glands. And we're going to focus on, we kind of skipped over that in lab in favor of just looking at the different tissue types. We're going to talk more about the glands today. And remember, we mentioned this in lab, but I want to go over it a little bit more again, is that all of the cells within our epithelium are going to exhibit something called polarity, meaning they have different poles or different sides. So they have an apical surface, which is the surface that is closest to the opening or the outer layer. They have a basal surface, the closest that is closest to the basement membrane, and a lateral surface, which is the side that's going to be touching the other epithelial cell. So we can see here, this is the apical surface, is the outside, the basal surface is down here by the nuclei, and then the lateral surfaces are those right in between the cells where they touch. Now remember that our epithelial tissues have three names, right? And they are going to be, like, for example, we might have simple cuboidal epithelium, right? So the first name is either simple stratified or pseudostratified. That's going to be this guy over here. And so simple means there's one layer, stratified means there's more than one layer of cells, and pseudostratified means there's really one layer, but it kind of looks confused, and it looks like there are two. So where every cell actually touches the basement membrane, but not every cell may make it up to the apical surface. And this is going to be really common in columnar epithelium. Now the second name is going to be based on the shape of the cell. And so if we have the cell is really flat and it looks like a fried egg, we call it squamous cell or squamous cell. If the cell is about as wide as it is tall and it's kind of cuboid, it's called a cuboidal cell. And if the cell is longer than or taller than it is wide, we call it a columnar cell. Now we also have special cells that we find in the bladder and the urinary tract that actually change shape based on the stretch involved, and those are called transitional cells because they transition from one shape to another. And then finally, the third and final name for epithelial tissues is epithelium. Right, so we always say epithelium at the end to signify that it's an epithelial tissue. So on the free or apical surface, which is this top area here of the cells, we can have a couple of different cell surface modifications. And we mentioned these a little bit during lab that you could look at under the microscope, but I want to talk a little bit more about the function for those. So one, it could be smooth, like on this one. This has a nice smooth top over here, or right here. This is smooth, this is smooth. All of these are smooth. And especially if we have, if we're lining, like the serous membranes are going to line the inside cavities, like our pericardium, and they're going to cover the heart. Those are going to secrete that serous fluid, and that's going to help reduce friction. And the fact that they're smooth and they don't have any, cilia or microvilli or anything is going to help reduce friction. So some cells are smooth on top, and that can help reduce friction. Some of them have microvilli. So microvilli are these tiny little guys over here. these little microvilli, they are the smallest of the cell surface extensions. They are going to increase the surface area for absorption or secretion. And they also do not move under their own power. And so these guys are going to be found a lot in, let's say, your digestive tract, right? Because we're absorbing and secreting a lot of things in our digestive tract. You'll also have some in the kidneys. You're secreting a lot of things in the kidneys. And so this is important to know. And if you see it under the microscope, sometimes it's called the brush border. And sometimes they have enzymes on them, especially in the digestive tract, to help break down some proteins and things, the brush border enzymes. So these are microvilli. They're the smallest. Next, we have cilia. So cilia are over here. And cilia are they are bigger than microvilli, and they are also powered. So the cilia actually move. So the cell is not going to move, but because the cell is like stuck, right? It's connected to the basement membrane over here, and it's connected to the other cells, so it's not going to move. But we're moving things. So the mucus layer usually on top of the cell is going to move. Or in the fallopian tubes, which is the oviduct, the cilia is going to be to move that egg down the fallopian tubes into the uterus. So these cilia can move things. So they're going to be mucus or the oocyte or different things. And then these really long ones over here, we're not going to talk about them as much in this chapter, but we'll talk about them a little bit in chapter 16, are stereocilia. And stereocilia are like elongated microvilli that they don't really move on their own, but we'll see them in places like the inner ear, where they're going to be really important for sensing movement. So they're special for sensation, and some of them are going to be for absorption, but a lot of times the ones we'll talk about mainly are going to be the ones that are going to help for sensing movement in the inner ear. So along the lateral and the basement membrane and the basal surfaces of the cells, we have these cell connections. And so these are different ways that our cells are going to be connected to the other cells. And epithelial cells and muscle tissue are going to be connected together by these cell connections. Our nervous tissue, as well as our connective tissue, are not as closely packed. So the cells have a lot of ground substance and things in between them. So they're not going to use as many of these, especially in like connective tissue. But the epithelial tissue especially, this is where we're going to see this good example of, has these cell connections. So this right here would be like the apical surface or the free surface, which is smooth. Then these are the lateral surfaces right here. And then this is the basal surface on the basement membrane. And so it's important because this is going to help make one layer of cells. We're going to connect them together. And so it binds them together. It provides a method for the cells to communicate from one cell to the other. And also in some cases, it can make it impermeable. It performs, especially with these tight junctions, it can make it so that, urine is not going to seep out of our bladder and things like that. So the three main types of cell surface cell connections are going to be desmosomes, which are these guys here, and a hemidesmosome, we'll talk about that, which is like a modification of a desmosome. Then we have tight junctions, and along with the tight junction, I'm going to talk about the adhesion belt, which is under the tight junction. And then finally, we have gap junctions over here. This picture is not from your book, but I do like it. It's a little bit more colorful than your book, and it also shows the adhesion belt. So tight junctions are going to be strands or rows of proteins that link the cells together. It's usually towards the apical surface of the cell. It prevents the substances from moving between the cells or passing between the cells, and that's called paracellular transport when they move between the cells. So that requires the materials move through the cells rather than between them, and it makes it a lot more like watertight. An adhesion belt is found just below the tight junction, and it acts as a weak glue that helps hold the cells together. So that's these guys right over here. So what I like to think when I see this is I think of a Ziploc. If you've ever had like a Ziploc bag where it's got like, the Ziploc area and it kind of has like those two different lines and you zip it together. And if you Ziploc something together, you make it watertight, right? It's going to seal it. And we'll find these like in the bladder, right? Because we don't want the urine from the bladder to leak into the tissues and into the interstitial fluid. And so this is going to help sort of waterproof that. Next, we have got the desmosomes. Desmosomes are composed of proteins that bind neighboring cells together. And so we can see these guys right here. And each cell is going to contribute half of the desmosome. So they each have half of the desmosome, and then they bind them together on the inside. And the hemidesmosomes are hemi, right, for like, it's like half a desmosome. that they anchor the basal layer of cells of the epidermis into the underlying connective tissue. So they into the basement membrane and the underlying connective tissue. So here we have got these hemidesmosomes. You can see there's some intermediate filaments in here. And then the hemidesmosome, because the basement membrane doesn't contribute the other half of the desmosome, it's just the one desmosome that the cell is contributing. And then finally we have these gap junctions. So these gap junctions are really important. They actually form tiny fluid-filled tunnels in between the cells. And so our intracellular fluid can move in between from one cell to the other. It provides a direct passageway for substances to travel between cells. And this is really important because we can have ions moving between the cells in our cardiac muscle. And this is one of the things that helps our heart, all the cardiac muscles beat at the same time in a rhythmic, coordinated fashion. And we talked a little bit about our cardiac muscle and the specialized things that we found in cardiac muscle. We talked about the intercalated discs. And the intercalated discs are actually made of both desmosomes and gap junctions. And we'll talk more in more detail about that in 169 when we get to the cardiac chapter. This is the picture from your book. It goes through the same thing here, the tight junction up there with the adhesion belt under it, the desmosome and hemidesmosome down here, and the gap junction. So it's just another illustration. So especially prevalent in epithelial tissues because they are pretty much all tissue connected to each other. But we do also find these especially in muscle tissue like our cardiac muscle tissue. All right, now finally we'll talk about the basement membrane. We said that these hemidesmosomes are going to be attaching the bottom or basal cell layer to the basement membrane. But what exactly is that? The basement membrane is extracellular material, so it's not a cell itself, but it's formed by the secretions of both the epithelial tissue as well as the underlying connective tissue, and it kind of connects them together. It's like an acellular, meaning without cells, glue. So it attaches the epithelium to the connective tissue. It also helps guide the cell migration during tissue repair. So our epithelial tissues are very able to undergo mitosis. And so they, like if we scraped all of them off, they would be able to repopulate and they would go across the basement membrane to repopulate that. The basement membrane is also important because it can help act as a filter, especially in the nephron of the kidney, as well as like the blood-brain barrier. And so not every epithelium has a basement membrane associated with it, but most of them do. And I'm not going to be asking you about the different layers of the basement membrane, but know that there are some different layers, the basal lamina, the reticular lamina. It's composed of collagens, which is, remember, a type of protein that is found that the fibroblasts and things are going to secrete, glycoproteins, which is a protein with a carbohydrate attached, and proteoglycans. So it's made of a bunch of extracellular things, kind of gluing the connective tissue and the epithelial tissue together. All right, so now we're going to go into functions of epithelial tissue. And the functions of epithelial tissue are going to vary pretty widely depending on the type of tissue we're talking about. So the first function is physical protection. And so some epithelial protects the external and internal surfaces, and it protects us from dehydration, abrasion, and destruction, especially our skin, right? So the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium of the skin. We'll talk a lot about this in our next chapter for the skin. Another function of epithelial tissue is that it's selectively permeable. It's relatively non-permeable to some substances, but other materials can pass through it. And so we can use it like in the kidney to filter things in and out of the kidney, right? It's selectively permeable. Remember that all of our glands are going to be formed from epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue, some of them at least, is very well suited to form secretions. So the glands, the ones that form those glands, are specialized to secrete things. And they may form exocrine or endocrine glands, and we'll talk about those glands in a little bit. And then finally, our epithelial tissues also function pretty heavily in sensation. So when we get to the nervous tissue, obviously, or the nervous system, obviously nervous tissue is really important, but we do have some specially modified epithelium that is going to be called neuroepithelium that houses the cells responsible for sight, taste, smell, hearing, and equilibrium. So there's lots of these sort of modified epithelial tissue that really works with the nervous tissue to help us sense things. All right, so let's look at the different layers. So simple epithelium, if it's only one layer thick, usually simple epithelium is not going to be as good at protection because there's only one layer, but it is pretty good for diffusion of gases, filtration of blood, secretion and absorption, and things like that. So in the lungs, we have simple squamous epithelium. So it's very thin, just like this, and it facilitates the diffusion of gases. Remember, we said that diffusion is just when we have things moving through the plasma membrane. And if we only have one cell layer, we don't have, it's very, like, it means we have a plasma membrane here and one here. So things only have to diffuse a very short distance through that simple squamous epithelium. And so in the lungs, our oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to be diffusing through the capillaries and the alveolar membrane. In the kidneys, it filters blood. So we have some simple cuboidal epithelium especially. We also have some specialized cells called podocytes that are going to be filtered out. And so we're going to be filtering things. We're also going to be secreting some things into the urine, absorbing some things back from the urine. And so since it's only one layer thick, it's pretty easy to move things through that one layer. In glands, it secretes cellular products, right? So a lot of our glands have are only one layer thick. But we have a lot of like one layer thick areas, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. And then in the intestines, we have our simple columnar epithelium, and usually it has microvilli to help increase the surface area for absorption, and it's going to help absorb nutrients. Now, our stratified epithelial tissue, especially our stratified squamous epithelial tissue, is really particularly suited to protect us against abrasion, right? Because if we scrape the top, even 5 or 6 layers of this epithelium off, we still have a lot of layers left, and we can just regenerate that layer, and this is going to protect everything underneath here. The other thing is because it has so many layers, it's able to hinder the movement of materials through the epithelium. We said that the simple layer, it's really easy to move things through, so that's why it's really suited for diffusion. If we have a lot of layers, it's not as easy, and so it's good in some areas where we don't want diffusion of things to happen. We can have these thicker epithelium. As we said, the multiple layers are really well adapted for protection. And so as the outer layers are damaged, they can be replaced by these cells from the deeper layers. And so we have a continuous barrier of epithelial cells is maintained. Now, if we look at our different tissue shapes, squamous cells, once again, these are thin. And so if we have a simple squamous epithelium, then these are going to be able to filter substances and allow diffusion. And so they're thin and flat, and they're really good for filtering and diffusion, these simple squamous ones. And so simple squamous epithelium forms the blood and lymphatic capillaries, where we have a lot of diffusion happening between the blood and the tissues. It forms the alveoli, or the air sacs of the lungs, where we have diffusion between the blood and the lungs, and then parts of the kidney tubules too. Stratified squamous epithelium is going to be specially, as we just talked about, it's going to be specially suited for protection from abrasion especially. And so it's going to be found in places like the skin, the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, the anus, and the vagina. So different areas where abrasion might occur. And then we have columnar and cuboidal cells. These are usually going to be more for secretion or absorption. So bigger cells mean there's more room for organelles that can help with secretion and absorption. So usually our glandular cells that are going to make up our epithelium or make up our glands are going to be cuboidal or maybe low columnar. A lot of these columnar cells are going to be absorbing things within the digestive tract. We have a lot of cuboidal cells that are going to be secreting and absorbing in the kidney tubules. And then remember that our columnar cells may contain goblet cells, and so those goblet cells are making mucus, and a lot of our mucous membranes are going to be lined by these columnar cells with goblet cells. So I wanted to go through and remind you of this. We saw this slide already in our lecture. This is the sort of a concept map of the types of epithelium that we have. And so we have simple epithelium, which is one layer of cells. So we have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and pseudostratified columnar. And both of these might have microvilli or they might have cilia, depending. For a stratified epithelium, we can have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, and transitional. Now, stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, like we do have them, they're just not quite as, we're not going to talk about them as often. we see the simple cuboidal and simple columnar and pseudostratified columnar a lot more than the stratified versions. But do remember, if you look in your lab handout, in our lab PowerPoint, you have examples of where we can find all of these different types, the locations in the body. So you can make sure you go through in your lab PowerPoint, and I gave you that blank sheet that asks for each one, like what's the location, what's the function, what fibers, and what does it look like. So make sure you know that for all the tissues. So this stratified squamous is the other one that has another special cell surface modification, which is called keratinization. And we'll talk a lot about keratinization in chapter 6. And that's where the cells become filled with keratin, and they are extra protective. And this is going to be in our skin. So we can actually see those keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It's on our skin. These are the keratinized ones. We do have non-keratinized also found in like the esophagus and things. So I mentioned that I'm going to talk about glands here because we didn't really talk a lot about glands in lab, but glands are going to be made of epithelial tissue. And so glands are either individual cells, so like a goblet cell is a really good example of an individual cell that's a gland. It's a little tiny cell that secretes mucin onto the top of your mucous membranes. Or it could be a whole big multicellular organ like our, salivary glands, right? That's a big gland in there. And it's composed of epithelial tissue. And these glands are going to be either endocrine glands or exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are going to be covered in depth in chapter 17 and 169. And these endocrine glands, they lack ducts. That means they don't secrete their products onto the surface of the epithelium. They actually secrete their products, which are hormones, into the blood. So endocrine glands, just remember that they secrete hormones into the blood. They don't have ducts. And we'll talk a lot more about these endocrine glands when we get to 169. Although we will mention some hormones in 168, so it's good to know kind of a little bit about them. Now, in this chapter and the next chapter, we'll talk a lot about exocrine glands. Exocrine glands are going to be invaginated epithelium in connective tissue. So basically, let's say you have the epithelium up here, and then what happens is it dives down and it forms a gland. And that gland is going to go down deep into the connective tissue layer, but it's originally formed from the epithelial tissue. And so this gland still has a duct. The exocrine gland version still has a duct that connects it up to the top of the epithelium, and it's going to release its products through that duct onto the top of the epithelial membrane. And so the examples of this are sweat glands, mammary glands, and salivary glands. So like I said before, the unicellular exocrine gland would be like this little guy here. It's the goblet cell. And this is going to be secreting mucin. They don't contain a duct because they're only one cell long, so they don't really need a duct, but all the other ones will. They're located very close to or at the surface of the epithelium, and the most common type and the one we've identified in lab is the goblet cell. It secretes mucin that will mix with water and become mucus. Now, the most common, a lot more common is going to be a multicellular exocrine gland. So it has lots of cells, and it makes up like a pretty complicated looking gland. We have two different types of cells in these exocrine glands. We have the acini or acinar cells. These are the cell clusters of cells that actually produce the secretions. They're the ones that secrete like the sweat or the sebum or the breast milk or whatever you're secreting. And then we have cells that are just going to make the ducts. And these ducts just transport the secretions to the epithelial surface. And then the whole thing is surrounded by a fibrous capsule, and usually that's made of connective tissue. The capsule is going to then, in some areas, it'll dive down into the gland, and then there are these things called septa that partition the gland into lobes. So we can see here, this is going to be like our whole exocrine gland, and you can see that this like greenish part over here, right, we might have this capsule on the outside, and it's going to have some little septa that go through. Then these little red parts here are going to be the acinar cells, and all the yellow parts here are going to be the duct cells. So we can see the acinar cells here actually make the secretions, and the duct cells are going to just take the secretions, and eventually they're going to empty onto the top of the epithelial surface. So these multicellular glands are pretty complicated. And we'll look at them like the mammary glands, the sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, and the salivary glands. So we can classify the exocrine glands by kind of how they're made, their anatomic form. Simple glands have a simple unbranched duct. And so those are going to be a little bit more like some of the sweat glands and things that we'll see in our next class. Whereas compound glands are a lot bigger. Like this would be a compound gland. It has a lot of branching in the ducts, and it's got lots of different branches. It looks like a tree. And that's going to have branch ducts, and that's going to be more like the mammary glands or the salivary glands, where they're bigger. Tubular glands have the secretory portion and the duct are the same diameter. So if we look here, a tubular gland, we have about the same diameter. Whereas an acinar gland, the secretory or acinar portion forms like an expanded sac. And so it looks more like a bell shape or like a flask shape at the bottom. And then a tubulo-acinar gland has both tubules and acini, so it's kind of a combination of those two. So we can look here, and there's a couple, we can classify them based on what they look like. So remember, we said simple glands are very simple, where they just have one little duct and one little secretory area. And in our next chapter, where we're going to talk a little bit about sweat glands and sebaceous glands, these are going to be more like simple glands over here. And like this was a simple coiled tubular gland. So our sweat glands are coiled tubular glands. So we can see it kind of coils. So tubular has the duct part, which is the yellow, which is unbranched, and then the secretory portion are pretty about the same diameter. We could have a simple branched tubular, which means the duct part is unbranching, but the secretory part branches. Then this is a simple coiled tubular, where it just is coiled. Now, an acinar is another one where we have this, the duct part is rather narrow, but then the acinar part kind of bulbs out. And so that these cells are a little bit bigger, the secreting cells. And then we can have this simple branched acinar, which once again, the duct doesn't branch, but the secretory portion does. I'm not as really concerned that you know the anatomic classifications. We're going to talk a little bit more about the functional classifications next, and that's what I'll definitely be asking questions about. And so these are more the simple glands that we'll talk about like in the skin, whereas these compound glands, these are going to be found for bigger glands. So like, you know, the mammary glands and the salivary glands and things like that, where they are a lot more complicated. They have these, the ducts themselves are branched, whereas the little acinar portions are not branched. And so we have this compound tubular, where we have the secretory portion down here, and then this part is all branched, a compound acinar. And then this is a compound tubulo-acinar, where we have some tubular areas, and the bottom is acinar here. So as I said, this is kind of more FYI. It's a little bit more anatomical knowledge, but I'm not going to ask you as many questions on this. I am going to be a little bit more interested in the physiology of how exactly these glands secrete things. So this is more, that was like the anatomy classification. This is the physiology classification. And so I'm going to be, usually our lecture exams focus a little bit more heavily on physiology. So I'm going to be asking more about the physiology classifications of glands on the lecture exam. And so we can classify these exocrine glands by their method of secretion. So merocrine glands are going to package their secretions into vesicles and release them by exocytosis. Remember that exocytosis is a form of active transport, right? It's a vesicular transport where it makes a vesicle and it packages that stuff into a vesicle and it binds to the cell and just you know, spits it out. And this is the same thing that nerve cells use for secreting their neurotransmitter. And so good examples of these are the lacrimal or tear glands and the salivary glands. And so this, the merocrine gland merrily secretes via exocytosis. It's a pretty happy gland. It is not harmed during the process. Our apocrine glands, the apical membrane, remember this is the membrane that's towards the lumen, pinches off and becomes the secretion. So a portion of the cell, the apical portion of the cell, pinches off and becomes the secretion. So apocrine glands, half of the cell, or you know, half outside of the cell becomes the secretion. Examples of this are the mammary glands and the ceruminous glands. So the mammary glands, right, are going to be secreting breast milk, and the ceruminous glands are going to be found in your ear canal, and they secrete earwax or cerumen. And then finally we have the holocrine glands, whereas the whole entire cell is actually just going to rupture, and that ruptured cell is going to become the secretion. And so the sebaceous or oil glands in the skin are going to be a really good example of this. And so our holocrine glands, the whole cell ruptures and is destroyed and becomes a secretion. So the cell is not destroyed. This part of the cell is pinched off. The entire cell is destroyed. So we've got our merocrine gland, right? A good example is a salivary gland. They're releasing by exocytosis. Our apocrine gland, a good example is the mammary gland as well as that ceruminous gland. And so this is going to be pinching off the apical portions of those cells, and it releases it as the breast milk. And then this last one here, this is the sebaceous gland, and we'll talk about this in our next chapter here, where each of these cells kind of becomes the secretion and then it like ruptures and is then secreted. And you can see right here that we have a lot of mitosis going on in the basal layers of here, because if each cell is destroyed to make the secretion, we need to make a lot of cells in order to keep making more secretion. So we've got a lot of mitosis happening in the bottoms of these holocrine glands. So there's a really sort of catchy song. It's the exocrine gland song, and you can find it on YouTube. So I'm not going to play it right now, but you guys can click it and play it. It's to the tune of the Brady Bunch, and it goes through and it sings about the 3 different types, and it's catchy and it might help you remember. But I recommend going to watch that. All right, so this is our review of epithelial cells, and so we have this is the concept overview the concept overview page that you guys have for epithelium. I want you guys to definitely remember all of these different types and where they are found, right? So this is, like, if you remember no other locations, at least remember these. I'd prefer if you start remembering the locations and examples for each type, but these are ones that we'll talk a lot about. So first we'll start with simple epithelium. And so our pseudostratified is a type of simple. So we have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And this is going to be found in most of the upper respiratory tract, including the trachea. And it functions in protection. It secretes mucus, and the cilia propel the mucus, and they kind of pump it back up so that we can cough it up and get rid of anything that's caught in there. That's called the mucociliary escalator. So that's important. And we'll talk more about this again in the respiratory system, but I want to start you guys remembering this now. Other simple epithelium here. Simple squamous epithelium is going to be found in the capillaries as well as in the alveoli in the lung. And this is really well suited for diffusion of those respiratory gases. We have simple columnar epithelium is going to be found in the small intestine, right? And there's goblet cells in there, and there's microvilli over here. And this is going to help facilitate absorption. And right, the goblet cell is making mucus to cover that mucous membrane. In the kidneys, we have simple cuboidal epithelium. The single layer of cuboidal cells is going to function in absorption and secretion of materials. And so the things that, like the waste products, are going to be secreted into the urine, and anything else that we want to keep is going to be absorbed back, anything we don't want to urinate out. So that's really important in the kidney tubules. So those are simple epithelium. Then we have our stratified epithelium here. So a good example of the squamous is our non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. This is located in the oral cavity and the esophagus. It's going to help protect us from, like, if you're eating things that are sharp, if you've ever like swallowed a chip and you can feel it going all the way down your esophagus, it's good to have some protection in that esophagus. Now we also have keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. This is going to be found on your skin, in the epidermis of the skin. We will talk in detail about the epidermis of the skin and all of its layers in chapter 6. Then we have our transitional epithelium, and our transitional epithelium is going to be found in the bladder as well as in the ureters, so in the urinary tract. And so if the bladder is empty, it looks like they're nice and rounded cells. They're very rounded. Some of them are binucleated. So some of them have 2 nuclei. It's a little bit weird, but that's what transitional is. If the bladder is full, it's stretched out, so it looks like it's a lot thinner, and it looks a little bit more squamous on top. So they change shape, so they're transitional epithelium. So remember these specifically, and then we'll move on to the connective tissue. All right, so connective tissue, again, a little bit of this should be reviewed from lab, but tissues are confusing, so it's good if you hear it twice. So all connective tissue shares 3 basic components. This will be, well, probably, this is likely to be a question on your exam. I haven't written it yet, but I've used this question in many exams in the past. So what are the 3 basic components of connective tissue? So cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. And which 2 form the extracellular material? The protein substance and the ground substance. So most connective tissue, or all connective tissue, has cells, and different classes of connective tissue have specific cell types, and we'll get to that. Most of these cells in the connective tissue are not in direct contact with each other, so they don't really need to have those cell-to-cell adhesions or junctions like we talked about in the epithelial cells. There are two classes of cells, the resident cells, which stay in that connective tissue all the time, and the wandering cells that continuously move through the connective tissue. These are immune cells, and we're not going to focus too much on them now. We'll talk about them more in chapter 22 when we get to the in 169. So some of our resident cells. The resident cells are going to be specialized cells that produce the extracellular matrix. And so whenever we're talking about these resident cells, we have some descriptive word stems. So this is at the end of the word. So if the word ends in blast, it means that those are creating the matrix. So an example would be like a fibroblast. We said it's making those fibers. Or an osteoblast. That's going to be making the bone, because osteo means bone. A cyte is a cell that maintains the matrix. An example of this would be a chondrocyte or an osteocyte. These cells are no longer making new matrix. They're not making any new fibers, but they're maintaining the fibers that were already made and the extracellular matrix and the ground substance. And then clasts are going to be cells that break down the matrix for remodeling. An example of this, the main one we'll talk about, is the osteoclast. So in bone, you have some special bone cells that break down the bone to help remodel it. So if we go through, fibroblasts are the most abundant resident cell. They're going to be found in all that connective tissue proper, right? So like the adipose or areolar connective tissue and reticular connective tissue and dense regular and dense irregular and elastic connective tissue. And they're going to produce the fibers and the ground substance of the extracellular matrix. They appear flat, like flat cells with tapered ends. So they're probably some of the most common. But then when we start getting to some of our specialized cells, like in cartilage, cartilage is going to have chondrocytes and chondroblasts in it. So they're specialized to make the cartilage and the extracellular matrix in the cartilage. In bone, we have osteocytes, osteoclasts, and osteoblasts, right? Osteo means bone. Those are specialized cells that make up the bone. Adipocytes are fat cells. And they are going to be filled with triglyceride. Remember that triglyceride is the storage form of lipid, and this is how we're storing extra energy for the body. So some fat cells appear in small clusters in different types of connective tissue proper. So you might just see some fat cells in, the dense irregular connective tissue. But if they dominate the area, if it's pretty much all fat cells, then we call it adipose connective tissue. Mesenchymal cells or mesenchymal cells are going to be basically stem cells. So as you were forming in the body, the first type of connective tissue to form was called the mesenchyme, and we'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. And so some of those connective tissue cells, some of those mesenchymal cells have persisted into adulthood, and those mesenchymal cells are like little adult stem cells, and they're going to divide to replace the damaged cells. And at first, they can become lots of different types of cells, not all of them, but some different ones, and then once they divide to replace, like, say, a skin cell, it's going to become, that specific skin cell. And then finally, we have fixed macrophages, or dendritic cells. And so these are going to be immune cells. They're phagocytic. They eat other things. And they're going to be helping to monitor and protect that connective tissue. Once again, as a review, there are 3 different types of protein fibers. And the collagen fibers are the first one. I think of collagen fiber as, it's kind of like rope. It is flexible and it is strong, but it does not stretch. We find this a lot in tendons and ligaments, so it binds things together like rope. Reticular fibers, they are thinner than collagen fibers. They're abundant in the stroma, like they make up the framework of some organs like the lymph nodes and the spleen. And then finally, we have elastic fibers. They contain the protein elastin, and they stretch and recoil. And we find these in places like inside the elastic cartilage in the ear or in the skin, in the walls of our arteries as they withstand your heartbeat, and they kind of stretch with that. So collagen is a really important protein, and it strengthens and supports pretty much everything in your body. And one thing to know is that vitamin C is important and essential for creating healthy collagen fibers. And the disease scurvy is a disease that's caused by vitamin C deficiency. And you might be thinking in your mind of like pirates, because they've always said, like, you always think of pirates that don't get to eat any fresh food. They're eating like hardtack and biscuits and, old jerky and things because they're on, like a long time ago, they were, you know, on the sea for months at a time and they didn't have any fresh food. And so they would get like things like bleeding gums, they become weak, they'd have hemorrhaging and abnormal bone growth because if you didn't get vitamin C from, you know, oranges or, you know, even green leafy fresh vegetables, then you can't make collagen correctly. And so it's usually caused by a nutritional deficiency. And so this can be treated by consuming foods that are high in vitamin C or vitamin C supplements. So, you know, bring your lemons and your oranges with you on your pirate ship. All right, now last we have the ground substance. Ground substance is the non-cellular material that's produced by the connective tissue cells. And it's where the cells and the protein fibers live. Like it's kind of, it makes up the groundwork or the framework of all the tissue. It can either be viscous in the blood, so like the plasma of the blood is like liquidy and viscous. It can be semi-solid like cartilage, or it can be solid like bone. And the ground substance plus the protein fibers together, we can call that the extracellular matrix or the ECM. Now the pictures on this slide look a little bit confusing, and I want to mention some of the things that are that form the ground substance. And so ground substance can be formed by something called a glucosaminoglycans or GAGs. These are large molecules that have a charge that attracts cations and water follows. So this is going to add more water to our ground substance. We have got proteoglycans. Proteoglycans are going to be a glucosaminoglycan linked to a protein. And so these are some proteoglycans over here. This is the linked protein. We've got glycoproteins as the last one, are proteins with carbohydrates attached. And they're going to bind to the cells of the connective tissue and the fibers to the ground substance. This is getting a little bit more into more biochemistry than you need to know for this class, but I just figured I'd show a little bit. So we've got, this is our collagen fibers, this is our cells, and then we've got some of our proteoglycans kind of in between that are making up the ground substance. And so this is the collagen here, here's some more collagen, and then we've got some hyaluronic acid and proteoglycans over here that are going to be making up the ground substance. So I'm not going to ask you too much about these, but I just wanted you to know a little bit about what makes up the ground substance. So what are some of the functions of connective tissue? Well, this is really, really varied because remember that connective tissue is very widely distributed. We have lots of different things. So bone is connective tissue, cartilage is connective tissue, fat is connective tissue, blood is connective tissue, tendons and ligaments are connective tissue. So obviously all of these have very different functions. So the specific function of connective tissue is going to depend on which type of tissue we're talking about, but I'll go through some of them. So some of our connective tissue is going to be important in physical protection. So like the bones of the skull and the rib cage protect our delicate organs. A lot of it is going to support and form the structural framework of the body. So the bones obviously are the structural framework of the body. The cartilage in the trachea and the bronchi keep them open so that our airways stay open. A lot of our connective tissue binds things together. So ligaments bind bone to bone, tendons bind muscle to bone. Some of our connective tissue stores stuff. So adipose tissue is going to store fat as energy. Bone is going to store calcium and phosphorus. They're different minerals, and we'll talk a lot about that in the bone chapter. So transport, our blood specifically is going to transport things. So it carries our nutrients and our gas and our wastes. And then finally, immune protection. So some of our connective tissue is going to be forming like our lymph nodes and things. They're really important sites of protection. Leukocytes are white blood cells, and they're going to be found within some of these, like our lymph nodes and spleen and all these things that are made of this connective tissue. As we said, the reticular connective tissue makes up a lot of our lymph nodes and our spleen and like makes up a bunch of our organs, so that's pretty important. So remember, look back at our lab where we talked about all the different types of connective tissue. So there are a lot of them. So connective tissue proper, remember, is divided into loose and dense connective tissue. Loose connective tissue is going to be areolar connective tissue, adipose connective tissue, and reticular connective tissue. Dense connective tissue is going to be dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and elastic connective tissue. Then next we have three types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage, and two types of bone: compact bone and spongy bone. Those are going to be contributing to our supporting connective tissue. And then finally, our liquid or fluid connective tissue is going to be blood and lymph, but lymph doesn't really have many cellular structures. It's not that interesting to look at under the microscope, so we really just looked at blood. So this is another one of those really good concept overview interactive pictures where I want you guys to at least know all the location and functions of these that are on here. Obviously, try to know them all, but these are some of the really common ones that we'll talk about in class. So connective tissue proper. So dense connective tissue. Dense regular connective tissue is found in ligaments and tendons. And this is going to be important in binding muscle to bone and bone to bone. So dense regular connective tissue, ligaments, and tendons. Dense irregular connective tissue is found in the dermis of the skin. We're going to learn about that in chapter 6, so definitely make sure you know that. We'll be learning about it in 2 different chapters. It binds the epidermis to the underlying subcutaneous layer to the skin. And so this is going to bind like your cutaneous membrane together. Elastic connective tissue here is going to be found especially in the aorta. So this one is one of those stains that stains the elastic fibers really dark, right? The Verhoef stain, and it's going to be found in this really large arteries, the elastic arteries, because when your heart beats, it's putting so much pressure on the artery has to stretch a little bit. And so it's going to be found within the large arteries. It's also found in the vocal cords, right, because that needs to be kind of elastic. All right, now we'll talk about the loose connective tissue. Adipose connective tissue is going to be found in the subcutaneous layer of the skin, right? That's going to be like the fat just under the skin, and it's going to help us store energy, as well as it cushions and protects the body. Areolar connective tissue is also found in the subcutaneous layer of the skin, and this protects the tissues and the organs, and it kind of binds the skin and the epithelial to deeper tissues. So this is like very much of like a binding tissue. It kind of binds things together. And then reticular connective tissue. This is found in the spleen, in the lymph nodes. It makes up kind of the meaty organ, the meaty part of those organs. It supports and surrounds the structures of the organs, and you can see there's a lot of white blood cells in there, so it has an immune function there. Now we'll move on to the supporting connective tissues. So we've got cartilage. So elastic cartilage, a good example of that is the external ear, right? So if you sleep on your ear, it will eventually jump back. Hyaline cartilage is going to be found in the costal cartilage here in between your ribs and your bone. It's also found in the in your growth plates, and it's found in your articular cartilage, so all the cartilage that's in your joints. And it's going to help with protecting the ends of the bones. It also supports the bones. It helps make your joints nice and smooth so that the ends of the bones are nice and smooth. They're covered by that cartilage. Fibrocartilage is going to be found in the intervertebral discs in your back. And we'll learn about this again in the skeletal system. And this has this collagen in it so that it's really strong to withstand weight bearing and it withstand compression. So the fibrocartilage is found in weight-bearing areas usually. So the meniscus in the knee is a pad of fibrocartilage also. And then bone. So finally bone. This one is compact bone specifically, and this is going to be found, you know, in the bones in your skeletal system, right? And this is going to be strong and hard, and it's going to be important for protection as well as support. And now finally the fluid connective tissue is blood, right? This is within the blood vessels and within the heart, and it's going to be transporting nutrients, gases, and waste throughout the body. So remember, there's a lot of things that are made of connective tissue. Connective tissue is pretty much anything that's not epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, or nervous tissue. So now the last things we're going to talk a little bit about are muscle tissue and nervous tissue. This is just an introduction to these tissues because remember that muscle tissue we'll cover in detail in chapter 10 and nervous tissue we'll cover in detail in chapter 12. So muscle tissue is very unique because it contracts when the cells are stimulated, right? So we've got, you know, our muscle, and you really can't see my arm, you can contract it, and that causes movement. And so this is voluntary motion of the body parts, contraction of the heart, and propulsion of material through the digestive and urinary tracts. So there are 3 types: cardiac, skeletal, and smooth. And I showed this already where you can kind of see the differences. Make sure that you can identify the different types of these under the microscope for our lab quiz and eventually the lab practical. So skeletal muscle here is going to be found in our muscles that we move, the voluntary muscles, and it's striated. It has many nuclei. Cardiac muscle is found where? In the heart. It is also striated, but it has these special intercalated discs, and it's involuntary. So you can't tell your heart to beat or stop beating. So skeletal muscle is voluntary and striated. Cardiac muscle is involuntary and striated. And then smooth muscle is going to be found lining the hollow organs of like your digestive tract. It's also your blood vessels, in your reproductive tracts, like in the uterus, things like that. And skeletal muscle is not striated, and it's also involuntary. So think about like moving the food through your digestive tract. You don't have to tell your body to move the food to go through your digestive tract. It does it on its own. All right, now finally we have nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is going to be really important for information transfer. And so nervous tissue is located in the brain and the spinal cord as well as the nerves. And it has two main types of cells called, the big ones are called neurons. They receive, transmit, and process nerve impulses. And so that's going to be these guys over here, or this big guy over here. And the small ones are called glial cells. And these glial cells are going to help support and nourish the neurons. And they do not have electrical potentials. They don't transmit nerve impulses. So I'm going to briefly mention parts of a neuron, although we're going to go over this in detail in chapter 12. The cell body is also called the soma, and that houses the nucleus and the other organelles. And then there are some different cell processes, or like things that stick out of the cell that extend from the cell body. The shorter and more numerous processes are called the dendrites. And I think of them as the rabbit ears on those old TVs where you had to like move them in different directions to get a good signal. They receive the signals. Those are the dendrites. And you've got usually a lot of them. And then the axon is going to be the signal. This sends the signal. It's one long process usually that is going to send the electrical impulse down to another area. And then neurons are usually the longest cells in the body. They can be starting, in the bottom of your brain and go, all the way down your arm to your hand muscles and things like that. And then that is it. That's going to be it for today. Now, next lecture, we're going to talk about how our tissues work together to form organs and body membranes.